If you have a dehydrating question, I have the answer. Hi folks, it's Darcy from the Purposeful and today I'm taking your dehydrating questions and giving some answers. So recently I asked all of my communities about anything that they had a question about dehydrating, and I would give them an answer and make a video of it. So here we go. Okay, so the first question came from Linda. How do you keep foods from flying all over your dehydrator? Generally, this is only a problem with those of us that have a cabinet style machine, which is the kind that your trays slide in and out of instead of stacking on top of. 3 things. Do not start your dehydrator until your door is fully shut and engaged. Don't open your dehydrator until that fan has come to a full and complete stop, just like keeping your arms inside the roller coaster. Until it stops completely, if you open that door, that fan's still running, it's going to blow everything out. Ask me how I know that. The third thing is when you're putting your produce on a tray inside your machine, especially if it's leafy greens that tend to dry small and just start flying because they're so lightweight, but it can happen with other things as well. Take a second set of mesh and put it on top. So you've got your tray, and if you have mesh in your tray, then use it. Then put your produce on top, then put another sheet on top. When you slide it in, just leave it there, because likely that will take care of any kind of flying up and out that you might have. And also just remember, if your machine is clean, you can just grab that stuff off the bottom and it's just as good as the stuff that was on the trays. You don't have to worry about it. Just use it because it's good. Peggy asks, can you add more food into a jar that you're already storing food in? And yes, you can, as long as they are both completely dry. So you know they're fine either way. You don't want to store something you've just dried into a jar full of food that might be a little off, or adding food that you might not have gotten done well into a jar that you've already done, because you're just going to waste everything. So once everything's been dried, conditioned properly, you can add them together. I choose to give myself about a 6-month window, that if it's older than 6 months, I tend to just start a second jar. Once you hit that 12-month to 18-month hill for dehydrated food storage, that's the optimal. You don't want to add something new into something that's kind of on the decline. So I give myself 6 months to try to rotate through that before I add them together. You can give yourself a little longer if you'd like, but yes, of course, you can put them together. Colleen asks, can you use old vintage jars that have the kind of bubbles in them for dehydrated storage? You can. You can use any container that is airtight. And what I mean by airtight is that there is no exchange of air in or out from the lid or even from the mechanism, okay? So let's say that you have a canning jar, and of course I do all this and I don't have, okay, this will work close enough. So I have this. This is a small jar of cranberries. This lid is airtight because when you do anything to it, you're not getting air coming in and out of it. That doesn't mean that air doesn't exist in the little pockets here, but what it means is that you cannot exchange any kind of air inside and out of this jar. However, if you have, and I wish I would have brought one, and I didn't, so we're going to use this as an example. This jar you can squeeze, okay? And in squeezing, you can hear air coming in and out of it, which means it is not airtight because you can exchange air in and out of it, all right? So this would not be considered a good form of storing anything for storage in your pantry of dehydrated foods, because air and thus moisture can get inside and out of the jar. Now, using this for short term, for doing like your herbs or whatever, anything that you're going to shake over a meal, whatever, this is fine for very short term, but I wouldn't store long term in anything that you can do this. You're not going to be able to hear it, and you can hear the air coming in and out of it. So that goes for plastic, especially the cheaper plastics, any kind of Ziploc bags. I even don't consider food saver bags great for dehydrated food for long-term storage because it's still plastic, and plastic is air permeable, which means over time air can transfer into it or out of it because it just is plastic, okay? It's great for storing things in the freezer. I just don't want it for things that I'm going to store my dehydrated foods in for a long term. That doesn't mean that people haven't done it and been successful. It's just not my primary goal to put my food into plastic. into soft plastic. Let me try that one again. You'll often find containers at the Dollar Tree or any kind of those lower end plastic things that, especially like I showed you with that jar, if you squeeze it, you can hear air coming in and out of it. Don't use that. But also that softer plastic doesn't work well to stop the air permeability. Now, if I'm going to use a plastic to store my dehydrated goods in, I'm going to show you the example of this. This is a hard case plastic. I would trust this more than I would trust softer plastics. So this is a Progressive canister that has a clamping lid to it, okay? So when you put your lid down, you clamp it closed so it creates an airtight seal. As opposed to the OXO kind of containers that have this little pop button, and when you put your things in it and then you press this, it's supposed to form an airtight seal. Now, I was all excited when I put my pantry together to do all of my food that I could into OXO containers, and I still love them. I love the way that they store, the way that they stack, that they don't waste a lot of space like circular jars can. However, these are not reliably airtight, but you can use them if you need to. I will be transferring everything that I bought for OXO back into the clamp style plastic containers like this. Because one, my grip is no longer great, and as I'm getting older, I'm starting to think about, what's it going to be like trying to peel off heavy glass jars out of my pantry, and I want something that's lighter, still airtight, and will work. So these kind of things will work just fine for dehydrated foods. Okay, you can use things like this because you have a clamp. Let me see if I can do this without making it. Your clamp has the rubber gasket to create that airtight seal. Okay, just like that. You clamp it down. It's not going to fit quite right now, but there you go. You can use the old vintage glass jars. All right, whether you're using this with a lid or you're going to use one of these gasket kind, you just need to make sure that you have the rubber seal that's supposed to go here on the connection. I don't have one for this jar, but I love it. I keep it because it came from a family member that we wanted to remember, so I kept this jar. I just need to buy new gaskets for it to actually use it. Also, you can use those vintage zinc tops like I have, like this one right here. They are still great for storage if what you do is use an older canning lid on the inside to help create that airtight seal, because on its own it no longer is airtight. So I will use that for something like this, okay? So it works just fine. You can use WEC jars. You can use any kind of the clamp jars like this. You can use containers that you got from the grocery store, that maybe your spaghetti sauce or Alfredo sauce or any kind of hot sauce, any of those kind of containers that clamp down well, you can use those. Okay. All right. So I hope that helped. Michonne asks, how long does biscotti last? Now, biscotti in the terms of dehydrated food versus when you're actually making biscotti is two totally different things. Biscotti in dehydrating is when you take any kind of quick bread or cake or anything like that and you dehydrate it to get a crunchy snack. And we like to call it biscotti because it's kind of, but it's not really. It's not quite the same, but there's really not a really great word for it. Somebody once described it like Melba toast, and I don't think they're even kind of close, but that's what you're doing. You're dehydrating those things to give it a new and different life, and they're great for having as a snack with coffee or tea or whatever that you can have. They make fun, different ways to eat a chocolate cake or a brownie or even dehydrated donuts. Now, I'm not big on donuts in general, but dehydrated donuts were fun. And I did one of those not too long ago, and I'll leave a link to the video up here, down below, whatever. There, it's in the channel. So you can do those. They store for, I don't know how to tell you how long they store, because it will depend on how much fat is in each of them, how you store them, how often you're opening that jar and introducing new moisture into it. I would not expect any of them to last more than a few weeks, okay? You may get longer depending on the particular bread or cake that you're drying. Excuse me. But they are not meant for long-term storage. They are meant for short-term snacking, kind of things like that. Okay, so then Chantal asks, do you have to sterilize jars before using them with dehydrated foods? Washing them in hot soapy water fully drying them is all that is needed. You can certainly sterilize your jars if you would like to. You can put them through the sterilization process in your dishwasher. You can boil them. The next question was a couple of people asked, so I'm going to combine them all together. Can you dehydrate canned food? So that's food that's already gone through either a water bath or a pressure canning or a commercially canned process first, and then can you dehydrate them? The answer is yes. Okay, so let's go through a couple of scenarios about why you might want to. One, you have way too many jars, too many cans or jars if you've home canned them, to fit on your shelf, and you need to make more space. You can then go ahead and dehydrate it. You've already lost all the nutrients that you need to worry about in the canning process, so you can just go ahead and dry them. They will not always turn back into something that you can use on a side dish on its own. Like say you did canned sweet potatoes and you decided that you wanted to go ahead and dehydrate them because you have so many you cannot use them. So let's dehydrate them and do something else with them. So I wouldn't say that you could slice them and then dry them and then rehydrate them later and have them be good slices of sweet potato. What you could do is mash them and then create sweet potato mash, dry that, and then you can always make that into sweet potato mash later, and that works just fine. You can do it with canned fruits, and in some cases those canned fruits actually may have a better texture for you than if you dried them fresh. In some, for me, pineapple is one of those things. I much prefer a canned dried pineapple than I do fresh pineapple dried. One, because it's not because of the sugar, okay? It's not because it's got more sugar in it. It's because the texture changes. When you've pressure canned it, that pressure canning, whether you do it or you buy it, breaks those fibers down a little more than fresh pineapple, so it makes it a more pleasant experience for me, okay? I just enjoy it better if it's already been processed that way. You can do any kind of vegetable, you can do any kind of fruit. So let's talk about meat. Canned chicken that has been either commercially canned or that you've canned, that pressure breaks down the chicken and it creates a better end product when you rehydrate it than if you did it from cooked chicken that you made yourself and you just cooked it, then you shredded it, then you dried it. There is a difference in the quality of the chicken when you rehydrate that is better if it's been pressure canned first. The same way, it's the tenderizing from it that just makes it a better product. Now, can you store that? Yeah, for a while. But it's best to store it in the freezer until you need it, whether you're doing a hiking or camping trip, whether you're going to do a meal in a jar. I wouldn't recommend doing any kind of meat for long-term storage on the shelf. It's most optimally stored in the freezer, but it makes it easy to then transfer to use on the road still dry, if that makes sense. I know that there are people who do store it on the shelf and they have no problem. The thing is that meat's expensive and you went through a lot of work to get it dry. And meats can, over time, mold if you didn't get it dry enough, or they can turn rancid from the fats that are in the meats, or the proteins start to break down after a while, and it's just better stored in the freezer if you want to stay safe. Do what you want in your kitchen, okay? That's the optimal way to store it. How do you store dehydrated cheese? You put it in the freezer. Okay, dehydrated cheese in most cases is so full of fats, the natural fats that come from cheese, that fat can turn rancid pretty quickly on the shelf. So once you've dehydrated it and you spend all that time getting all the oil out of it, because you have to go through a lot when you're dehydrating a lot of cheeses because they start releasing all of that fat in the oil. Okay, and so you have to go and pat them dry, or you have to put layers of paper towels, dry it, change out the paper towels, dry it some more, change paper towels, dry it some more. It's just a process with cheese to do that. And I would rather buy it freeze dried, even though it's kind of expensive, because then I don't have to go through that. It's shelf stable. I don't have to do anything else with it to store it. But in the long run, it's best stored in the freezer after you've dehydrated it so that it doesn't turn rancid on the shelf and just waste all of that time for you. Now, there are times when you can dehydrate it, take dehydrated cheese and use it out on the road. Maybe you're going to create a couple of meals that you want to eat in the car that you want to just add water to and go. That's how you can use it, still storing it in the freezer, but able to use it while you're out hiking and camping and backpacking and all those kind of things you're doing, or if you're doing a road trip or whatever. But I wouldn't suggest storing it long term on the shelf like it is. Another question came from quite a few people with different kinds of foods, but why does it take so long for my food to dry? Or is it even done yet? Why isn't my food done? Those are kind of all of the kind of versions of this question. The thing is that dehydrating is a patience game. The time is relative. No matter what a book tells you, that the window, or even my website, the window of time that anybody gives you is what is recommended, what is tested, what it should take, all those kind of things. But in your home, it's almost always going to be a little different. Maybe it's going to be shorter. Maybe it's going to be twice as long, because it's affected by your home's humidity. Whether the atmosphere outside your house or inside your house is really humid and you're not using air conditioning, then that humidity is in the air. Transferring the humidity from inside your dehydrator to the air around you, it can't transfer as well because the air is already saturated. So it's going to take longer. It will depend on how you prepared your food. So when you slice a lot of foods, it's recommended for about 1/4 of an inch is the thickest slice that you want to use. But if you did 1/2 inch, it's going to take longer. If you didn't pre-treat your food in the way that it should be done, if it needs it, and then you want to dry it, oftentimes it's going to take you longer. So let's take case in point, grapes or any kind of full skin berries. You need to break that skin before you dry it to make sure that the moisture on the inside can get out. So either you want to blanch it, you want to poke it, poke it with a stick. You want to freeze it for long term, freeze it for a couple of days, not just for an hour. You need to get a hard freeze. One of those methods can be the way to break the skin. You don't have to do all of them at once. Once that skin is broken, as it starts to dry, the moisture can escape. If you don't do it and you just have this round whole berry, it will take much, much longer to dry. Okay, so it takes some time. Then if you have things like whether your food has been in the refrigerator for a while and is kind of getting towards the end of its life versus something that's pretty fresh and full of moisture, those two things will take different times to dry. Okay, so it just is one of those things that you're just going to have to learn. Take the time to let things dry. You rarely can over dry anything. Over drying something like jerky or fruit leathers can happen. You might dry some fruits more than your preferred texture likes to eat them, but if you're going to store them, you really can't dry many things too much because you want them fully dried. So just be patient. So to test things, you want to take out samples and let them come to room temperature. Let them cool off for 5 or 10 minutes, just long enough to let the heat off. Then test it. Don't test it while things are still warm because that's not going to give you a true test if it's dry. Once you've let it cool off, you test it. If you open an orange slice and you still see that there's moisture still in it, if things are way too flexible, if they don't snap like they're supposed to, put it back in and just let it keep drying. You can dry it overnight. You can just leave your machine on if you're comfortable with that. If you'd like, turn it down to its lowest temperature, let it dry overnight, turn it back up the next day. Those are the kind of things that you can do to ensure that your things get dry fully. That's probably one of the biggest stumbling blocks for new dehydrators is that they haven't learned yet that some things are just going to take time. No matter if a book tells you it's going to be done in 4 hours, not going to happen in most cases. It's going to take a little time. Okay, now more questions came in too about storage. So not just the kind of jar you use, but what do you use in your jar for storage? So you have 3 options. You can do nothing with it. They have 4 options. You can do nothing with an airtight container that's the right size. It's all you need. You need nothing else. Okay. Properly dried, properly conditioned, and properly stored in the right kind of container. That's all that's needed for any of your dehydrated foods. However, some of you live in high humid areas where if you open the jar, you're putting a ton of moisture back inside from humidity, or you're in and out of your jars all the time, or you're wanting to store fruits, there's lots of reasons why. A moisture absorber would be the next thing that I would use. That's what these are right here. Okay, I'm going to take one out because you can do this with moisture absorbers. Oh, come on. Well, am I going to open this? There it goes. Sorry. Okay, this is what a moisture absorber / desiccant pack / silica gel pack, that's what it looks like. It's full of little silica beads on the inside that absorb moisture. If I'm going to use anything, this is what I'm going to use because this helps this helps regulate the moisture that's introduced into a jar when you open it and close it. It is never meant to be the thing to finish off your dehydrating job. You don't use this in conditioning. You don't use this to put into something that you didn't get quite dry enough, and then you put this in hoping that'll finish the job. Never use it that way. It's not meant to be used that way, and it may not work, and you'll have mold. Okay, so this can be recharged. You can, if like I like to get the color changing one, so it will tell you that it's all been used up, it's absorbed all the moisture it's going to absorb. Then you can put this back on your dehydrator trays for an hour or so, or maybe 2, and it will dry them out. And then you put them back in their package, and you can use them again. I would use this on things that are problematic for clumping, like powders that tend to clump because of humidity. I would use this in environments where you live in a very humid environment and you're in and out of the jar all the time. I would use those to help control the moisture that's being introduced later. I would use them on fruit. I would use them for those reasons. I don't normally use them on many things anymore because proper drying, proper conditioning, proper storing in regular size containers is about all you really need. But I do, like I said, I do use them on powders that are problematic and in fruit. Okay, so then we move to oxygen absorbers. Oxygen moisture absorbers remove the moisture, the humidity that's in a jar. Oxygen absorbers only remove the oxygen, not all of the air. The oxygen, like light, heat, air, and oxygen are the things, no, I'll try that again. Light, heat, moisture, and air. Okay, oxygen, actually it's not just air, but it's oxygen, are the killers of food for long-term storage. So if you're going to use an oxygen absorber, you can only use it once. If you open the jar, you've got to toss it and put another one in. It doesn't create a vacuum seal in all cases. Sometimes you can get one from it, but not always, because it's only removing the oxygen. It's not removing all the other elements that are in the air. I find them not necessary because I don't store my dehydrated foods for 4 or 5 years because they don't last that long. Over time, dehydrated foods start to degrade, and I would rather just use them within that first 2 years before I would try to store them for 5. It doesn't mean you cannot use them, and they are good for other long-term storage of dry foods that you want to put away for years. Okay, I'm not saying don't use them. I'm saying I don't think they're necessary for dehydrated foods. I know that people use them, and I'm not saying don't, but I am saying it's just not necessary. And when you can't find them, you can't get them, you don't know how to use them, it's okay. You don't need them. All right. So then the fourth way is to use vacuum sealing, where you take a machine, whether you use a handheld brake bleeder, which is, and I can't pull it out right now, sorry. It is a mechanism that you squeeze and it creates a vacuum inside of a jar. It usually works better than a vacuum sealer does because you can get bigger pressure out of it. It will remove all the air. Or you can use like a vacuum sealer, like a Food Saver or a Nesco or Cabela's. They have them, and then you put that on a jar or a bag, and you can suck out all the air. That works that way as well too. Okay, that was a long way to say you don't have to use anything. Okay, if you properly dry, properly condition, properly store, you're good. If you want to use more, know why you're using it and what to use. Moisture absorbers remove the moisture, which is the biggest issue for dehydrated foods. Oxygen absorbers or vacuum sealing. Okay. Okay. JES Bradley 25 asks, how did you get into dehydrating? How did you get to be such an expert? I'm going to say right now, I am not an expert. I am self-taught. Back in the day, a long time ago, when we were young, didn't have a lot, we were trying to store food and our freezers were full. And I knew there were ways to preserve food other than freezing that I could tackle. I knew I could not can. I knew at the time I didn't want to can because I was afraid of canning. I didn't have anyone to teach me. I was afraid I was going to make my family sick. All those things that happen with canning. My grandmother canned, but she was no longer in a position to teach me how to do it now that I was ready to learn. So I was in a forum about saving money, frugal food stuff. And it was long before the internet was the way it is now. Yeah, way long ago. And they were talking about dehydrating. And I thought, dehydrating? You mean like that you can do that. And so I started investigating. And the more I investigated, the more I realized this is something I can do. So I started saving my pennies. And they were pennies back then. So if I had extra money from the food budget that week, I would toss it into the little bin where I was storing this money. And I saved up to get a Nesco FD80. It is the square Nesco. It is a great machine. I love that thing. I think it would probably work better than any Nesco that I've had since then, that I've tried, given away, I tried and kept and whatever. I wish I'd kept it, but I didn't think that I had the space to have 2 dehydrators back then. Little did I know. But once I got an Excalibur, I went ahead and got rid of the FD80 to somebody who could use a start on their thing. So I read through that forum, realized there was so much more to learn. I started reading everything I could get my hands on, books, websites that were available back then, and there weren't videos that I could go and watch that I could find. And so I just was self-taught, and I read everything that I could get my hands on. And I learned that there are lots of schools of thought about what you can and can't do with dehydrated foods. And once I got into the National Center for Home Food Preservation and kind of read their guidelines about why they say this and why they say that, knowing that they've not tested everything, I get why they say what they say. And so it's one of those things where if you've learned how to dehydrate and you've learned the mechanics and the reasons, then you can go off and do what you like, and you can do that without worry that you're going to mess something up, as opposed to just throwing something on hoping that it's going to work. The education about why things work the way they do is helpful. So while I've never taken a master dehydrator class from any of the extensions because they're not offered in my area, I have learned a ton, both from what I've learned on my own from studying and then talking to other friends. And then I have learned so much from online, from all of you and from the Facebook group, of new ways to try things or new ways to use something. So I'm no expert because there's so much more for me to learn, but I really want to share this information with you so that you can learn how to dehydrate for yourself, to stock food in your pantry for your family with things that they're actually going to eat, and learn how to do this safely and effectively. Okay, so the last question we have is from Trish. If I was going to buy one book on how to use food, which one would it be? And I would tell you, don't yet, okay? In the beginning, learn how food dries, how it rehydrates, how it's going to taste on its own versus if you decide to put some in another meal. The best way to use your dehydrated food is to just replace your fresh with your dehydrated in things that you already cook. So let's take tacos. You're going to make tacos, you're going to brown your meat, you're going to put your taco seasoning in, and you're going to add some stuff to it. So maybe you're going to put some onions inside that taco meat before you put it on your in your tacos. The onions that you're going to put in there already, use the stuff that you have that you've already dehydrated. 1/4 cup to 1/3 cup. It's just one of those play it by ear, play it by sight kind of things. You'll kind of learn down the road what you like because it's cooking. It doesn't have to be exact. Put that to replace every cup of fresh. Okay, so if you're going to put like a cup of fresh onions in there, put 1/3 of a cup of dried onions in there. And that way you've replaced fresh with dehydrated, and you start learning how it works in your food. If you're going to make a soup, just take some of your soup. If you're going to have like 2 zucchini and maybe a potato, you can take those equivalents in dried, put them in your soup, allow them to cook. You're going to want it to simmer long enough to rehydrate and then cook. And then that's how you learn how to use your foods and stuff that you might already eat. Now, if you want to start creating meals just from dehydrated foods, that tends to be called something like a meal in a jar, a meal in a bag, or things like that. I have a post on my website on the Purposeful Pantry called the Best Meal in a Jar Recipes. It's an entire list of a ton of resources for you to be able to find meals that you can put together just like that. They are links to other sites that I have vetted, so I know those recipes are okay. And while many of them might call for using freeze-dried foods in the recipe, you can replace that with dehydrated. It's fine. It's not like you have to use freeze-dried. Although I would recommend if you're going to do that, use freeze-dried meats and then everything else dehydrated. So those can give you some ideas about how to put things together to create a meal. Now, you don't have to store it that way. You can still put it together from what is in your pantry and then make that meal that day. But that's a good place to start, because then you can kind of play around with a few things and see if you like how it works. And then if you're ready, I have some book suggestions on that post that tell you some of the better books to get that are specifically for that. There's going to be some backpacking and hiking ones. There's going to be some regular dehydrated ones that are, from folks that just dehydrate versus people that are hikers. So all those resources are available for you for free. So when you're ready, then you can use one of those to purchase if you find that this is the way that you really want to do it. So I hope that helped, Trish. Let's see. If you have any other questions about dehydrating, drop them down in the comments below, and I will be happy to answer anything. If you want to see more of dehydrating, and if you're starting to learn, I want you to check out this series right here in that box. Just click that box right now, and it will take you to the dehydrating class that I offered 2 years ago for 30 days of dehydrating. Okay? It'll teach you how to dehydrate. So until I see you next time, happy dehydrating.